Well, hello, everybody. This is Alan Starling, and we're going to be continuing our series on Nehemiah. I see we have a new curtain. The other one's being repaired, probably. And so we'll ring up our curtain to start the next session, which is part 3 of Opportunity, Restoration, the Nehemiah Story. Now let's have a look at what happened so far. Nehemiah is a Jewish captive in exile in Persia, which is modern-day Iran. He hears news that Jerusalem is in shambles. The walls are broken down, the gates have been burnt, and the people are demoralized. So this really affects him, and he weeps, and then he prays. And last week we looked at his prayer, and he confesses his sin and that of his people. He identifies with them, and the reason why they're in this country is because they have sinned against God. He reminds God of his promise to bring the people back to their land. So God says, when you return to me, I will return you back to your land. And then he asked God to give him favor with King Artaxerxes. So we're going to pick up the story after this. And then he waits for the decisive moment. I like these curtains, don't you? So we come on to part 3, Opportunity. Now, the first thing we notice is that it says 4 months later. 4 months. Remember, he prayed and he said, give me favor with the king today. And 4 months have passed. But this is the day, I believe. Nehemiah writes, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. So the king asked me, why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled. Well, he had prayed for 4 months for this very opportunity, this brief window that would allow him to say something to the king and ask him permission. Timing is everything, and now it's arrived. And Nehemiah writes this, I was terrified. Well, why was he terrified? Well, it could be a few different reasons, but one could be his job description. See, not only was he the king's cupbearer, but he was in charge of making sure that everything was happy and gentle, and there was no negative things, no sadness, no thing that make the king upset. It just had to be so nice in there. And already the king's noticed that he's looking sad, and that's not part of his job description. And then he's about to ask a huge favor of the king. You know, somebody said it's like making a marriage proposal. But in this case, the consequences could be very much greater than if you were rejected from a marriage proposal. He could lose his job. He could lose his head. So he's kind of terrified, but he's ready. And 1 Peter 3:15 says, if someone asks you your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. Always be ready. Well, this reminds me of the elevator speech. Some of you may not know about that, or if you're in another country like South Africa, it'll be the lift speech. Anyway, this was invented by Steve Jobs, who was the president of Apple, and he had a huge building, and he made this practice of getting in the elevator and seeing one of the staff members shaking his hands and says, tell me what you do here and why it's so important. And that person had the time it took to get to his floor before, if he didn't answer properly by then, he was in trouble, may even be fired. But you notice that Nehemiah got his answer in. He replied, long live the king. How can I not be sad? for the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire." So the king asks, "Well, how can I help you?" Here's the big moment. Another elevator speech. And the elevator's going up, and he gets in with a prayer to the God of heaven. Well, how long was this prayer? You remember the previous one that we studied was fairly long, but this prayer could have been one of the shortest prayers in the Bible. The king is asking a question. The king is waiting for an answer. And if he doesn't give him the right answer right away, the king may either go on to another subject or might send him away. So this is an important question. He was ready, and he had already prayed for favor with the king. He'd been praying constantly for 4 months. And I'm sure the prayer was something very brief like this: "Lord, this is the moment," or "Here we go," something like that. That's all he had time for, because the elevator was moving. And so it's now or never. But he could have been thinking something like this: "Why should the king let me go? He's going to lose his cupbearer." And apparently the cupbearer was a very important job, and they didn't give it to many people. I am his captive. Why is he going to just let his captive go? I was taken away from Jerusalem, so why would he want to send me back to Jerusalem? If he says yes to me, he's going to think, what's going to happen to all the other Jews? They are all going to want something. So this is a dumb idea. Well, thankfully, Nehemiah didn't think of any of that stuff. No, he replied while the elevator was going up, he replied, "If it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried." Whew, gulp. He said it. He's been waiting 4 months, and the time came, and he said it. Well, the king asked him another question: "How long will you be gone?" Now, Nehemiah may not have been ready for this answer. He was expecting a yes or a no, and this is like a provisional yes. How long will you be gone? Another speech to be made on the elevator, and made quickly. But he could have been thinking, "Oh, I never thought about that, how long I'm going to be gone." And it all depends on how many people are there to work, how long it takes, and he could rattle off a whole lot of problems. But no, he didn't. He said, "I'm ready," with an answer, and he'd been ready for 4 months. So the elevator goes up, and he says, "I told him, and he granted my request." Isn't that great? Now, the king is totally in charge of everything, isn't he? If the king says yes, it's yes. If the king says no, it's no. And if the king says you're dead, you're dead. So I'm wondering why Nehemiah put in this little phrase. He said, "The king, with the queen sitting beside him, gave his permission." And I wonder if perhaps he was watching the king's face, and the king just looked very momentarily at the queen, and the queen made just a kind of a microscopic shake of her head, and the king said, "Okay, you can do it." Well, that's all conjecture, but this is not conjecture. Proverbs 21:1. It tells us, "The king's heart is like a stream of water directed by the Lord. He guides it wherever he pleases." And Nehemiah was counting on that. And then he continues to write, "I also said to the king, let me have," and then he gives a list of things that he wanted. So I think he's just striking while the iron is hot. Now that the king is in a favorable attitude, maybe he can get some more things because he may not have this opportunity again. So he asked for a passport and a visa. Well, in those days, they didn't have passports and visas, but they had a letter from the king with the king's signet on it, saying that he had approval to go there and asking for his protection and so forth. And he was very glad that he had asked for that later. And then he wanted a requisition order for some timber. Now, I don't know what they had in Jerusalem at the time. Did they have Lowe's or Home Depot or Hank's Hardware where he could go and buy the lumber? Well, actually, he got permission to go to the keeper of the king's forest and ask for the timber. So he had letters ready for that. And then these were not spur of the moment requests, because he'd been not only praying for 4 months, he'd been planning, and he was ready when the moment came. And the king granted these requests, he says. And now, he could have followed that with, the king granted these requests because I know how to get what I want. But no, he didn't say that. He said, because the gracious hand of God was on me. Well, Nehemiah was that kind of man. All the way through the book, you see that he acknowledges God, he acknowledges other people, and he gives them the credit where it's due. Now, he was one of these people who liked the ordinary plus idea. You remember, if you want to do something extraordinary, this is what you do. Well, Nehemiah was in this spot, and he did the ordinary. He asked the questions to the king. God did the extra, and between them, they did something extraordinary or extraordinary. William Carey is called the father of modern missions. He was a missionary who went from England to India, and he had this slogan: expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. And I really like that, and I actually put it on the bottom of my email, so every email that I send out has that on it. And I like to quote it to people, and sometimes I try to think, now, which came first? Was it attempt great things for God, or was it expect great things for God? Well, as I sat and thought about it, I realized that you cannot attempt great things for God unless you are expecting great things from God. So if God has something for you to do, expect him to do great things and help you to do it. Well, that was nice. He had a good time there, but then he went on this journey. It was 1,500 miles, and we're not told a lot about that. But when he got there to Jerusalem, he had a rather ominous reception. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite heard of my arrival, they were very displeased that someone was coming to help the people of Israel. What an attitude! And this is the first hint of coming trouble. And believe me, he had it all the way through the project. Anti-Semitism is not something new. It goes way back to the time of Sanballat. And as we know, through the Bible, it's been prevalent, and through history, it's been very prevalent. And there have been people who thought they could wipe out the Jewish people. They didn't like them because God had chosen them. And both of these men were governors, so it wasn't just like some ordinary people complaining. They were people in authority, and they were going to make it as difficult for Nehemiah to get this job done. Well, 1 Peter 5:8 tells us this. Stay alert. Watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. So we're told to be ready for opportunities, but alert for trouble. It's like driving a car. Don't they tell you this when you get your first license? Drive relaxed and alert. Drive defensively. You may be obeying all the traffic rules, but what about that guy that's about to drive through a red light? So we need to be relaxed, but we need to be alert. And piloting an airliner is becoming easier and easier in one sense, because some of these new airliners, they have all the redundancy in them. They have something like, if the pilot wants to turn the plane to the left, there's a certain system that does that. If it fails, another one takes over. And if that fails, a third one takes over. That's why these planes are so safe nowadays. But some experts are a little concerned that the pilots could become complacent. I flew into Hong Kong one year, and when we touched down, the pilot came on the horn, and he said, "By the way, ladies and gentlemen, did you know that this was a completely automatic landing? I didn't have to touch the controls." And I'm telling you, when you're driving in Hong Kong, you fly right over these buildings. It's such a confined space, and you'd think that you would need a very skilled pilot to get the plane down. Well, some experts are concerned that because planes are so easy to fly, the pilots will become complacent. And so that's why they're always putting them into these simulators, and they're going through all the possible things that could go wrong and learning to react to them with split-second notice. And that's what we have to be too. We've got to be ready. Notice Peter says, stay alert. Well, now he gets an enthusiastic response. That's a bit better. Nehemiah first made a private inspection. Then he saw everything firsthand. It's one thing when you're 1,500 miles away, somebody to tell you about the place is all in shambles. It's another thing to get there and find out firsthand. Then he spoke to the city officials. He said, "Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace." And he says, "And then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me and my conversation with the king." So he faced them with the reality, we're in a mess. Then he encouraged them with, the king is behind us and God's grace is with us. And they replied at once, "Yes, let's rebuild the wall." So they began the good work. Well, it's time to put something in our take-home box. And actually, we have 5 little things. I hope that's not too much. I do believe it will fit in there, though. First one is be ready. Second one is be alert. And then expect great things and attempt great things for God. So, let's put them in our little box here, and we'll note that next time the opposition begins. So it's time to ring down our curtain again on another episode of Nehemiah and Restoration. And may God bless you, and may you have a great week.